Ali and Giorgio Regni with the Scality podcast for this month. How are you doing, Giorgio?
I'm doing great. Hi, Paul.
Hello. You and I have been busy. We've had a product launch in May with Scality ADI, and then we had two of the tech field days with Stephen Foskett. Those were fun, huh?
Yes, the AI Field Day, not to be confused with AI Infrastructure Day.
Right. There's two, and they're slightly different. They were good, and I think we always like doing those, and we had been at something like 13 or 14 of them before, so quite a history. And the topic that we wanted to talk today also has a history for you and I, which is file storage, object storage, and how can you do files on one side and objects on the others, right? So we've been thinking about this for 12 years, maybe longer for you, right?
It's always been a question.
It's always been a question, right? And I guess where we want to lead is that it's not as simple as asking, can an object store present the data as files? You have to ask much more, right? So that's what we kind of wanted to dig into. I wanted to rewind us back to the early days. This is 2010 when we were really, kind of one of the first vendors doing object store. Well, you were. This was before I joined. And we all realized that, Amazon was coming up, but there was really lack of clarity that S3 was going to be the de facto, right? Or the default or the standard API. I mean, you remember all the choices we were thinking through at the time, right? It was Dell EMC's API and a CAS API and what else came up, right? There was a CDMI, SNIA standard. So lots of choices. I mean, proprietary was one choice. And it was actually something we considered, right? Because the large vendors have an installed base.
I remember some of the email partners like OpenWave, they were not scared to do development and just use a C library.
Okay. So you give them basically a language API that can work too.
So at the end, they went HTTP, but they could have gone direct with just a C library. So it
Right.
was different times, right?
Yeah. The problem, of course, is that the apps weren't really in mass using these APIs, right? What we needed was the ISV community to start embracing it. And so it wasn't clear. It took even a few years after like 2014, 2015 for it to become much more clear. I certainly remember at the time that we all said, what's the number one feature we need? And it was file, right? It was NFS or SMB. And this was because the apps and the users were so used to it, right? You guys, Scality, you guys meaning us, but before I was there, did implement CDMI, right? Kind of the bypath object storage API, but it didn't seem well embraced. Is that true?
Yeah, CDMI was doing more than S3 in terms
Mhm.
of at the time, because now S3 has caught up with a lot of features, but it was always slightly different enough that people didn't want to use it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, for us, I think we saw that to enter the enterprise market where people weren't yet completely familiar with object storage or Amazon and still had a lot of legacy apps, file was important, right? So it's something we looked at very seriously and the industry did as well. And I think overnight we saw a pretty big market of gateway vendors coming out. I mean, in that time frame, these vendors that we're showing here, Panzura, Twinstrata, Cetera, Store Simple, Nasuni. You also remember QStar. I remember Bridgestore. There must have been more than that, right? And we probably looked at them all. And we were absolutely in the middle because we wanted to support files. So we looked at them, thought about partnering, and even the idea of acquiring one or two of them came up, right? And I think the value is there, right? Because the minute we could say we have a platform that lets you keep your data on a single system, single easy to manage system, but you have file storage and object storage together. And even better, you can give the advantages of both. That would be kind of the nirvana.
Yeah. And I remember the initial market was hosting providers,
Mhm.
a company that host web servers or these kind of things. They wanted to provide an object API like S3, but they didn't have the like Amazon had a great machine to train developers, right?
Mhm.
Amazon reinvent, you have training online, they will assist you to port your application,
That's right.
which some of these small hosting companies didn't have or didn't know how to do. So
Mhm.
for them, having a gateway simplified everything because you could say, oh, this is iSCSI on one side and object on the other, or NFS on one side, things that people know, right?
Right. Absolutely. Kind of created a familiarity. So, of course, we went down this path, or many of the vendors did, and the gateway really ultimately had a limit, right? The object store did what it was intended to do. It scaled. But in the end, the gateway ended up being kind of this small straw, this bottleneck. You had to think about, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of clients coming through this tiny straw. to access the data. And I think that was the key flaw. Do you remember it the same way?
Yeah, I do. And one of the biggest one was the number of files you put in a folder, right? On an object store, you don't think like this. If
Mhm.
you have an entry, you just add it to the bucket and automatically it's going to be there. And you could have billions of flat entries into the same bucket, right?
Yeah.
On a file system, you have to do directory hashing. The industry has this rule of 10,000 to 20,000 files in the directories. And this clashes because the metadata engine on the file system side has nothing to do with the type of metadata engine on the object side. And
Yeah.
when you want both of them to coexist, it creates a lot of issues.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember this well. Even, before this, we had the idea of making NAS systems bigger and then scale out NAS, but you still had to think the minute I get to tens of thousands of files in a directory, the listings are going to go
Mhm.
slow and inserts are going to go slow and all of that, right? So it sort of defeated the purpose. There's this idea that you have compatibility issues when you start faking a folder from an object store to the file system. Can you give a few nuggets on that, on this
Yeah,
concept?
so I think it came from Amazon. They created this like a slash is like a folder, right?
Hmm.
And now you have this search by prefix where you're going to use it to emulate file system by
Yeah,
saying, find me. So if there's a folder called backup, so you look at the object store and you say, give me everything that starts with backup slash,
that's right.
and that should be the backup folder, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But that is going to send you much more data because it gives you everything that starts with backup, including the subfolder and the subfolder and the subfolder, right?
Yeah, that's
So
right.
you had to do some intelligence on the listing side to stop when you need to. The object store give you a list in certain order, which is
Right.
not the order that the file system has.
Yeah.
So you're kind of fighting these two different indexes, one
Yeah.
over the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I remember this, right? You had to kind of say slash user slash my files slash whatever, and then keep the organization on the file system side. So big pain, big pain. I remember that. Well, in the end, the gateways had a limitation, right? And the limitation, well, let me start again. Objects scaled, right? This was the promise of the technology. It always had this advantage. Flat namespace, it can go to billions of files or objects and millions of clients. But now with gateways, you extract the metadata and the gateway has to maintain that. And that ends up being the limit, right? So this is where you start having this kind of performance and scalability clash again with the gateway approach.
So we discovered that the hard way. So this was a production customer. I'm not going to name the gateway for, and this gateway was providing block devices to the end user
Yeah.
for VM storage. And it had this feature, which was their claim to fame, what's total encryption.
Mhm.
So anything in the cloud object store
Yeah.
was fully encrypted and not readable by the object storage vendor. But the customer lost the key,
Mm.
the
No.
the master encryption key. So they had this, I think it was 200 terabyte
Hmm.
of volumes that nobody could read.
That's a lot of files.
Yeah. And when they asked the actual gateway vendor, they said, no, we don't store a copy of your keys, which is actually right?
That's the right answer.
And if you have lost it, everything's lost. So you could imagine there could have been a backup of the key encrypted with an emergency backup, or there could have been another set of keys or a way for the admin to retrieve
Mhm.
it, but it was all stale, dead data.
Oh my. I guess this is what happens when you have two centers of truth, two namespaces, right? You
Mhm.
sort of start having these consistency and
Yeah.
security and access issues.
And some of the confusion comes from I just bought an object store that can do 10,000 operations in parallel, but my gateway can do five, right? And so should I add more gateway? Oh no, they don't talk to each other. So
Mhm.
you have this impedance mismatch in a way.
Yeah, yeah. That's true because people would start thinking, let me have multiple gateway instances, but they don't see each other. Right. So that's a big, big challenge.
So that's another key difference. Object storage is immutable and
Yeah.
people won't really understand it,
Mm.
at least not immediately.
I,
Where on
I
a
agree.
file, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think this is a hidden difference for a lot of people. They
Yeah.
think with a file system, I'm changing files in place. I'm changing my data in place. But with an object, it's a completely different semantic than POSIX, right? So it's what you're saying. You cannot just change an object in place. It's immutable.
And so things like I'm going to store my logs on the object store. Somebody just added a line to the log, right?
Mhm.
Well, you cannot just add a line.
Yeah.
You actually download the entire log file, change it, and re-upload the entire log file.
Same with appending, right? Adding
Yeah,
something to a file or an
yeah,
object.
same.
Okay, very good. So I guess in the end, it's always going to be a trade-off. Is that an accurate statement? And you have to think about what you can live with. What's your primary design point, and what are the things that you're willing to compromise on?
Yep, I agree. There are two different systems, and you need to decide if you're going to be object first or file first. And then there's some more decisions to be made.
Okay. So if I want total POSIX semantics, like it says here on the slide, that is one choice. And if instead I say I need to see the data on both protocols or both semantic styles, that's another choice.
Yes. And if you go full POSIX, there's no way that you can have a one-to-one match between object and files.
Got it. Okay. So that you're really giving up one over the other.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. That's a challenge. This is one that I remember very well when we looked at all the vendors. Some of them map a file to an object store one to one, right? So you can actually go and see file foo bar is in the object store, which is great. But on the other hand, it doesn't scale as well, right? You're going to get these huge files. You're going to not get the same amount of kind of parallelism in access. So others decided to do chunking. I'm sure you remember this very well.
Yeah. And going back to the previous idea, if you need full POSIX, you need to chunk, right? Because you need to be able to append, which is maybe adding another chunk. But that also means that you have even more objects to manage in the back, because one file could be 10,000 objects or more.
Yeah.
So you might be loading your object store unnecessarily, but you get benefits like modifying is not as much of an issue. If your chunk is 1 megabyte, you are uploading 1 megabyte, but it's not the entire file, right? Allows you to append, allows you to have indirection between the object and its folder. So maybe you can do links and hard links, right?
Yeah.
But it's something you have to know in advance,
Yeah.
how the system behaves.
I get it. Makes me wonder if there were systems that offered configurable chunk sizes. I'm sure there were, huh? Because it is such a trade-off.
There were, and depending on the use case, so I remember going after use cases where we had to ask for 64 meg chunk size because of the way the application behaves. Some other one, we had to go to something like 256K, right?
Wow, that's an extreme difference, huh? Okay, so in the end, the user's expectations are going to be, reset, or they're really constant, right? If I'm a POSIX user and you give me a mount point, I'm going to use it as if it's a normal NAS or file system, right? I'm going to start filling it up. And so it's kind of this expectation that if I have file, I'm going to use it as I use file systems. And if I use object, I'm going to use it the other way, right? It's what it says here. The interface presumes or assumes what the workload is going to be. And that's going to be wrong in a lot of cases, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you and I think file system, and most of the people listening, when they think file system, what do they think about? User directories, home directories, right? And this is where we're all sharing them. We're all going to make small reads, small writes, listings. We're going to access things interactively, and we want to have good response time, right? That's what POSIX does well. It's great on a NAS, but it's exactly what object storage isn't going to do well, right? Instead, object storage is going to be great at huge capacity, big throughput, right? I'm sure you kind of agree with this perspective.
Fully, and we have an example. It was a school that used Scality to store PDFs, diploma PDFs, photos of students, things that make sense for an object store. But they did it via NFS.
Yeah.
Because that's what the application knew. And it ran fine for months until somebody decided to mount it with home directories. So the students were using Linux, and it will auto-mount the home directory to the NFS of the Scality system. And it worked until they started to do databases, to do Git checkout, to do all these operations that expect very small I/O that is flushed immediately.
Yeah.
But do not fit an object store characteristics.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, and in fact, I remember that at the time we said the right workload profiles, obviously this big capacity and throughput, were, as it says here, media repos, right? Big video files, medical image like packs. And then there was another one, of course, backup, right? Backup, the vendors were still using NFS and SMB at the time. That's a pretty good workload for object storage, especially as we saw the workload sizes increase. Yeah. Well, so then looking at all this in the end, and the gateways have their limitations, Scality decided to build their own file system, their own scale-out file system. So maybe worth a few words on that.
Yeah. And so as I said earlier, and you agreed, you need to have compromise. So it's not a generic file system. There are some tunable, or there are some decisions we made so that it can work well on an object store. But so this is what we decided. It has to be full POSIX compliant. So you
Oh,
can do all the POSIX operations. Now we also decided it wasn't meant for small IO. So it's not about flushing 4 kilobyte pages or doing things that require a lot of small IO.
right.
So we optimize for throughput
Mm-hmm.
and larger object.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the right decision for our use cases,
Yep.
and but makes it great for some use case, but not suitable for others.
Yeah.
And we're really upfront with these decisions.
Yeah, I do remember that the decision to be very POSIX compatible was a good thing, right? Because we had lots of good compatibility with the apps at that time. I certainly don't remember many of them running into these huge problems.
Now we had everything you need for POSIX, even SMB and Samba on top. We never complain about missing an ACL or things like that.
Right, right.
So we built a database system called Mesa that actually uses the object as
Mm-hmm.
its storage.
Okay.
So that gives you the same scalability as the object store, the same benefits of the object store. He understands that these are immutable and uses that to optimize and to do things like copy on write and do its own two-phase commit on the directories. Sorry
Mm-hmm.
for going deep
No,
into the
that's good
algorithm.
stuff.
And also the same thing we do for object. Objects are databases in our system, or I mean files.
Mm-hmm.
Files for the file system are databases in our system composed of objects. And if you change the middle of a file, from the database, we know which object this was,
Mm-hmm.
and the object is immutable. So we'll download that object, change whatever needs changing, and upload a new object, and then update the database for that object to say this section is now this new object.
Got it. Got it.
Okay. And the way we've done this allows you to have multiple readers, and you know that what you read is always a stable version
Mm-hmm.
of the file system, of the file data.
Yeah.
That works great for scale,
Mm-hmm.
but it wouldn't allow you to do small file I/O, which it was completely fine for us because this is not the use case we go after.
Right. But like you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's consistent, right? That
Yeah,
means the file system
everything is
view.
consistent along the way. Everybody gets the same view of the data at any point in time.
Yeah. Can I ask you who came up with the clever name Mesa? Because Mesa in Spanish, I think, is table, right?
Exactly. Yes, this I was proud of myself.
A very good choice. When I joined, I remember we were working with one of the big national labs here in the US, and they were using our scale up file system, SOFs. And at some point, one of our engineers received a screenshot from them. Do you remember this as well? They showed us a 1 terabyte file in the file
Yeah.
system.
Yes.
It was pretty amazing, right?
Yeah.
Did you say it before that we also supported sparse files? Huh? That's a
Yeah.
very efficient
So
thing.
that's this database. So
Yeah.
file system, when you say POSIX compliant, there's a lot of cores that people don't necessarily know, but there's one called truncate.
Okay.
That allows you to change the size of a file, right? And let's say you want to emulate a block device, you're going to use a file.
Mm-hmm.
And if you need to emulate a 10 gigabyte drive,
Yeah.
you need to create a 10 gigabyte file, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to fill it up with zeros because that's going to take too long.
Yeah.
You're just going to say truncate to 10 gigabyte, and now your file is 10 gigabyte. If you were to do that on a regular object store, you actually do need to upload a 10 gigabyte object.
Got it.
In the case of a sparse file, the files are databases, so you just change a metadata in the database to say that this is 10
That's
terabyte.
so
Basically a no operation.
That's so efficient. I think that was always something we highlighted at the time, and it was
Yeah.
a very big good feature. So it scaled, right? I mean, efficiency, huge files. We had this huge deployment where we essentially had the largest file system volume on the planet. It was 100 petabyte single file system volume, right? And these were the types of promises that people wanted an object store for, but presented as file. All right. So in the end, this question is not going away. I mean, today we have the AI workloads, right? And AI workloads they have been file centric. They're kind of turning and becoming more object centric, especially as the big vendors embrace object storage. But it's still there, right? People still like POSIX. I don't think we're ever going to see it go away. Do you agree?
No. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do this conversation today is we keep hearing about new gateways to object store, like JuiceFS was a recent one. We heard from some customers deploying an open source project earlier this year that I never heard of. And we also, Amazon has S3 files.
That's right.
And this keeps coming up because each one of them has different compromise and trade-offs.
Mm.
So it's not this new one is better than the others. It's more what decision did they make when designing it, and does it suit my use case?
Yeah.
So if you were to ask only a few questions, that's what we have on slide 21. If you go to
Yeah.
the next slide,
Yeah.
do you need namespace compatibility? Yes or no?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If you need it, so do you favor object or file? Because if you favor file, then you need to have object on top of file and not file on top of object.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
If it's okay that object is protocol and principal one and file is just for read access, then you can export your S3 data on the same namespace with a file system using some of the Fuse open source project.
That's right.
And you get one-to-one mapping, and you can read via NFS or via Fuse or via Samba without any issues.
Mhm.
But that wouldn't work if you wanted to do things like renames and hard links and more POSIX
Yeah.
oriented features.
Yeah.
So that's a decision, and maybe it's great for you. It may be very bad for somebody else.
Yeah. I get it.
Which POSIX features do you need, right?
Mm-hmm.
That changes things too. And the other one is the chunk size. Are you okay if your IO ends up as 64 megs IO in the backend?
Yeah.
That's fine for a lot of backup use cases.
It is.
Or if you store large satellite videos like we do with some customers, it would be the worst possible decision for KV cache.
Yeah. I totally get it. It makes me also recall there was a time where we were very much talking to one of the other big hyperscaler clouds, and they must have had 5 or 6 file systems on top of their object store, right? And in the end, it was a bit confusing, but it made sense, right? Because all of them made these different trade-offs, right?
Yeah.
They had multiple offerings to fit the different workloads. So what you're saying here certainly resonates. Okay, well, I think that's the message, right? You've got to ask the deeper question. It's not just, do you support file on the object store, which was a common question. Hopefully this provided a little bit more insight into the next level of question to ask, so that it really works for the workload that the user is interested in.
Yeah. And as you said, I wouldn't be surprised that a large company would need different flavors of file to object.
Yeah, no doubt about it, because they're all going to have a spectrum of workloads. And in fact, it ties back into our observation, right? AI is not a single workload anymore. It's a whole bunch of workloads across the spectrum, all of them with different demands, right? And we think it's moving to object, but file is going to stay. And that probably requires different solutions at different points.
Yep. I
All
agree.
right. Well, very good conversation. Giorgio, thank you. And we'll see you the next time around. I'm going to just point our readers at our website, scality.com. And we have Giorgio's email here, so I'm not sure if you want to get emails, but now you might. Other than that, for people,
Hey,
they can visit us on the Scality YouTube channel, which is at Scality Videos on YouTube. Thank you very much.
thank you, Paul. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.